Welcome to Uncomfortable is Okay, where we explore the science, the stories, and the strategies of getting out of your comfort zone, navigating challenge, and doing the hard things that make life worth living. I'm your host, Chris Desmond. Uncomfortable is Okay is brought to you by Health Mentors. Health Mentors is a performance wellbeing company that helps change makers dial in their health and improve their performance in the middle of a chaotic world. We offer one-on-one health mentoring services, as well as a range of workshops and workplace solutions, all the way up to supporting organisations with their wellbeing strategy. You can find out more at healthmentors.nz or get in contact with Chris at healthmentors.nz. Welcome to the Uncomfortable is Okay podcast. Today I am joined by Belinda Morgan. Belinda is a coach, an author, and a flexible work specialist. Her recent work includes advising a global tech company on their part-time work strategy, coaching executives at a Big Four bank, and working with a large insurer to design a refreshed talent management strategy. In her work as a consultant, Belinda has seen firsthand how cultures that glorify overwork and prioritize profits above all else can be highly damaging to people's well-being, productivity, and results. She's also seen and experienced the enormous positive difference it can make when you find work that's both fulfilling and flexible. And as a result of these experiences, she's now passionate about helping organizations and individuals successfully embed flexible work arrangements in a way that benefits everyone. Belle, thank you so much for joining me. It's wonderful to have you here today.
Thanks, Chris. I'm looking forward to our chat.
I really like to start things off just by getting a little bit of background about you. So where are you from? Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born in a country town called Forbes out in central west New South Wales in Australia. And I grew up on a farm out there. So spent most of my early life out there. Yeah.
Cool. And we've had a couple of conversations before, and I didn't actually know that about you.
There you go.
So you were there kind of until you went to university?
I actually went to boarding school in Sydney
Okay.
because schools were a long way from our farm. So a lot of kids out there end up at boarding school. So I've kind of lived in Sydney for a lot of my life since I was about 12 years old.
Yeah. So kind of geographically, how far away is Forbes from Sydney if you're driving?
If you drive, it takes about 6 hours. So yeah, decent trek out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like living in New Zealand, everything is pretty close. Like you could almost drive from Wellington to Auckland in 6 hours if you had traffic well. Yeah, the scale is definitely different. Belle, what do you remember from kind of growing up that has pointed you down this path that you're on today?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I thought about that a bit recently. One of the things that I experienced growing up was that my dad actually worked from home because he is a farmer and his office, part of being a farmer is working out on the farm, which is kind of home, but a little bit away. But a lot of it is also doing office work. And so his office was inside our house. So interestingly, in the context of what's gone on in the past few years, that's something I experienced growing up, having my mum wasn't working early on when I was a child. So she was at home and my dad was working at home. And I think that has really played a part in influencing my interest in how can we have interesting and meaningful careers that we enjoy, but also do it flexibly and have time for other things in our life, whether that's family or whatever else it might be that you want to spend your time on.
Yeah. And have you always been engaged in interesting, meaningful, flexible work? Or is that something that you have come to more recently?
I think definitely not the flexible piece so much, but I have always been interested in the topic. So even right back to thinking when I left uni and started a grad role, I was an accountant back then and was working in one of the Big Four accounting firms. And one of the first things I noticed, there was lots of amazing things about working there. I met nice people at the time. The work I found pretty interesting. But one of the first things I noticed was the crazy hours people were working and how exhausted the partners in the firm looked to work. They seemed pretty old to me back then, but they were probably only late 30s to early 40s. And
At our age.
pretty much, I'm so old. And I just kind of looked around and thought, this isn't where I want my career to go, or this isn't what I see myself doing when I'm in my late 30s or early 40s. And so that question was seeded pretty early on, thinking back around how can I keep doing work I enjoy, but do it in less hours. I wasn't thinking about the concept of flexible work, but one of the things I did was I left that firm after a year for that very reason and intentionally sought out a slightly smaller firm that had a good reputation for having more life balance for their employees.
How old were you at the time? Early 20s?
Yeah, I was, early 20s. Yep.
Yeah. That is pretty self-aware for early 20s. I definitely wouldn't have been that self-aware at that point in time, I don't think.
I'm sure I wasn't self-aware in many other ways, but I was pretty conscious of what I wanted when it came to work.
Yeah. Belle, you've recently published your book, Solving the Part-Time Puzzle, which is fantastic. I've got a copy in the other room. Why did you decide to write it?
Yeah, and that's an interesting question. And I think why so I first became interested in the topic itself around how to succeed in a part-time role was for personal gain, really. I was working in part-time roles and found it challenging, as most people do, and really started looking into how can we all do this better. But as I started to unpick the topic and look into it more, what I realized that it wasn't just about personal gain for me. There's lots of benefits for organization, for society, even for the economy of getting part-time work right. And I think it was that realization that this is bigger than just my own personal interest that led me to think, how can I help other people do this better with what I'm learning and therefore write a book about it.
Awesome. And it's like we were talking about this beforehand as well. Part-time work and flexible work, while it's become a lot more visible in the last few years, is still a relatively uncomfortable topic, I guess, for a lot of people. And like looking back on my own experiences with part-time work, I was lucky enough to be able. I was in the position where I could work part-time after the birth of our first son, which was fantastic. When my wife went back to work, I dropped my hours and started working part-time. And then I've recently just had 11 months off as full-time dad, which has been absolutely amazing.
I agree.
But a couple of years prior to going part-time, one of the other dudes at my work dropped down to part-time hours. And I was just like, why are you doing that? So I think there's even seeing from myself, there's kind of that mental block around the benefits of part-time work. Although now that I've been involved in it, I obviously see them from my own personal perspective as something that is pretty awesome because it frees up space for other important things in my life. But if we're thinking about kind of trying to wrap our heads around part-time work and flexible work from like an organizational perspective, like why would an organization get on board with that?
Mm. I think you're right, because I think it is a really uncomfortable topic for organizations in that this perception that it's really a zero-sum game, that it's, lots of benefits for the individual who gets the part-time role, but that's at the expense of the team and the organization, the customers and everyone else around them who has to manage through it. And so for that reason, there's a lot of hesitance from organizations to want to create and really set part-time roles up for success. And so over the last, I don't know, let's say 20 to 30 years, it's mostly been women with young children working part-time. And women have done an amazing job of driving the part-time landscape to where it is today. But that's because organizations have kind of got on board with the idea, or in certain circumstances, like a mother who's got young children, we kind of have to offer it. It's the right thing to do. And in some cases, it's actually legislated that you need to do that. But outside that, it really hasn't been something that they've been thinking about. And it's really not something that they're looking to encourage. And, it's amazing to hear your stories of working part-time, because I think in many cases it's been really challenging for men to take up part-time roles or get part-time arrangements because of that idea or this perception that you mentioned around, well, why would you want to do that? That's going to damage your career. And isn't that something women do? And, what on earth are you thinking? So I'm not sure I've quite answered your question around what's in it for organisations yet, but I'll pause for a moment.
Yeah, it's an interesting reflection as well, and I think it's, I guess, part of the reason for my mindset at the time was that I did only view it through that lens of, oh, this is for mothers of young families, and like that's a horribly sexist thing and I'm sorry about that, but like at the time, I think that was my thinking about it, and like even kind of coming from that as well, when I stepped into full-time dad mode, like I think I may have talked to you about this as well, as like I wrestled with that decision for a period of time. Like my wife was going back to work full time. Our youngest son was born a couple of months premature, so we didn't want to rush him into daycare. And she was talking about stepping aside from one of her roles. She's got multiple part-time roles actually, which is, yeah, you should have a chat with her actually. It'll be a fascinating one. So stepping away from one of her part-time roles so that she could look after our son. But like from a family perspective, it made so much more sense for me to do it. One, I wasn't burnt out, but I was probably heading that way, I think. And also she earned a lot more money than I did as well. So financially, from a family perspective, it definitely made sense for that to happen. But I had this inner turmoil for probably a couple of months, kind of wrestling with that decision. But then we were talking about it one day, and I just said, hey, look, I'll quit my job and I'll stay home with Jasper. And as soon as I said it, my face just broke into this massive grin. Like there was this huge smile that I had. I was like, oh, this is the right thing to do. Why was I beating myself up and tying myself in knots about it for such a period of time? And I can only kind of think it was those kind of, I guess, social stereotypes that have like just been kind of reinforced into the way that we think about this topic for such a long period of time. And like it's been awesome to connect with you and with people like Gillian Brooks as well, and kind of start to hear more of these discussions and start to see kind of more discussions, especially about dads and people who aren't parents, taking on part-time work and part-time roles and flexible options as well, which is cool. And again, if we, in a very roundabout way, loop back to kind of the organizational perspective as well, as like, it's cool for us as individuals to be able to go and free up some space and free up some capacity to do awesome other important stuff in our worlds. But for the organization, like, how do they wrap their head around what's probably some kind of social stigma, some stories that are out there around like the necessity of part-time work?
I think the simple way is to just really get clear on what the benefits are of creating more part-time roles in your organization. And lots of people and organizations just don't think about it or are unaware of it. And once they are, they get on board more. So one of the, just relating back to the many reasons why people might want to work part-time, not just parents, as we talked about. One of the very topical things that's on organizations' minds at the moment that's relevant is how do we attract and retain the best talent in a very hot talent market? And there are a lot of people out there who prefer or also need to work part-time. So it includes absolutely parents, but also other carers who just don't have the capacity to work full-time. It includes people with disabilities that preclude them from working full-time, but many people in that category have amazing experience and skills and can contribute to your organisation. There's people who might want to take a phased transition to retirement, so it's a way to retain someone who's got lots of experience in your organisation who might otherwise retire straight away. Lots of people are interested in working part-time for a while. Lots of people. So some people have, side businesses or side hustles. Professional athletes is an interesting one. There's a bunch apparently of professional athletes out there who do that part-time and who also want to work in organizations part-time. And then another really interesting one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and not just professional athletes as well. I think there's a lot of kind of semi-professional or amateur athletes who, like, I used to work with Quentin Rowe, he's been the race walking representative for New Zealand for the last 15 years. He's been to 3 or 4 Olympics now. He has to work. So, and he's a physio. So I was working with him, and he worked kind of part-time hours so he could go out and train, because obviously if he's walking 50 Ks in a race, there's a lot of training time that's involved in that. So it's amateur or kind of high level athletes that aren't paid or aren't funded as well. And sorry, cut you off before your last important point.
No, not at all. The other interesting example I was going to share was I was talking to a friend of mine recently who has his own accounting firm, and he hired someone in who is on a visa, is a foreigner on a visa in Australia, and the visa only permits him to work 20 hours. And apparently he found it really hard to get employment before he started working for my friend James. And James says he is the best employee. He's got such amazing skills and experience. He's dedicated, he's motivated, and yet no one wanted to employ him until James took him on. So there's lots and lots of reasons and lots of talent out there. So that's one reason. Just kick off that question on why organizations should take this more seriously, but there's a bunch of others as well.
Yeah. And I think from what I'm hearing with you as well is that like a lot of the thinking around that is looking at the value that person brings to the organization as well, and kind of not thinking about them just as like a bum on a seat who is doing kind of an automated role. It's these, like the people that you've talked about and the situations that you've talked about. Like there's so many amazing people out there who have amazing experience and bring a really kind of robust skill set to a role, and then a unique perspective as well. And I think like as leaders and as managers, kind of viewing that and looking for that, and the people probably make it a whole lot easier to think about it in a more flexible capacity. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
No, I think it's this idea of how do we shape a role around a person rather than how do we have a very rigid role in terms of accountabilities and hours of work, and try to fit people into that. If we can kind of flip our thinking to the former. And I was actually talking to a legal firm in Australia who do exactly that, where as they hire people, they've got kind of loose job description, but they meet the people who are applying and they actually shape roles, not just the size of the roles. They've got a lot of people working part-time and in other flexible ways there. So they're happy to shape the size of the role of what flexibility looks like, but also what are your unique talents that you bring? So yes, we need you to do A, B, and C because that's an essential part of the role, but how else could you add value to our organization based on your background, your experience, other things you've done in the past? So I just love this idea of how do we shape roles around people, including how do we make it the right size? And I think that really is the future for getting the best people into organizations.
Yeah, that's a really forward-thinking way to look at it. With people who, I guess, the people who just think part-time work isn't going to work probably isn't. They're not going to be listening to our conversation here. And then you've got people like that you have been working with that who are already doing it, which is fantastic. But kind of for those who are on the fence, say leaders, managers, or even kind of individuals, how can we move our thinking from thinking, maybe it's a good idea, got a bit of an awareness around like these are some of the positives with it, to actually let's give it a go, let's experiment with it?
I think for lots of people, it's about the practicalities. So I meet a lot of people who say, I love the idea, or, leaders of teams or organizations. I love the idea of creating more flexibility, including more part-time roles. but I just don't get how it could practically work.
Yeah.
And that could partly be based on experience of having people in part-time roles and it not working. And so I think the best way for lots of people to shift their thinking is to give them the practical tools for actually making it work. So some of the things that leaders and organizations need to be thinking about is how do we not just offer someone a part-time role, but how do we actually put structures in place and systems in place to make it truly part-time? So if it was previously a full-time role, for example, how do we shave off some of the work and reallocate it elsewhere? And that's a blocker for lots of people. They just think, well, everyone else is busy. That's impossible. But there's many, many ways you can go about that. And how do we get the systems? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say, you got to do your 5 days work in 4 days.
Exactly. Yeah. Full-time
And just get paid
role on
in 4 days.
part-time pay. Yeah, exactly. That's a trap so many people fall into, and why people themselves in part-time roles in organizations then go, well, this just doesn't work. It's impossible. So, but there's lots of ways that you can go about actually shaping a role that's truly part-time and finding things to do with the rest of the role if it was previously a full-time role.
Could you give us a couple of ideas about some things that you could do to kind of to shape that role?
Absolutely. So what I always recommend first is, particularly as I say, for in this scenario where someone was working full-time or there was another person in this role and it was full-time and you're turning it into a part-time role, is really map out what's involved in the full-time role. What are all the activities that you spend your time on when you're doing that role full-time? And then start pulling that apart. Say, okay, what are the highest value add activities? And that can be based on just objectively, what are the things the organization most need doing, or, the things that are most important, but also based on the person who's coming into the role, what are they best at? Where can they add the most value based on their experience? So identifying those areas and saying, yes, absolutely, they're the things that should stay in the role. But then looking at the rest and saying, firstly, are there some things that we've just been doing in this role forever that don't need to be done? And often there's some non-value add activities that you can just go, let's just stop that. Or are there some ways that we can automate this or make it more efficient or, just make it take up less time? That's one thing. And then, of course, who else in the organization, although this work isn't the best fit for this person in this role, if we're trying to, cut it down to the things that are most critical, who else in the organization might benefit from doing that work now? Are there people in the team who this would be a really great stretch experience for if they take on this accountability? Or are there people who we know in their career objectives it's to do this type of work next? So looking at, yes, people might be busy, but if there's something that's really important to them from a career or experience perspective, there's often a way to find a way for them to get involved. And then you might, of course, do the same to their role and think, what in their role can they stop doing now because it's not as critical? So there's a few of the ways. The last one I'll just mention quickly is, this is one that organizations and people never think of or rarely think of, is let's say you've got 100% role, you reduce it to 3 days or 60%. You've suddenly got 40% of the previous salary left over. So sometimes hiring another person into the role might be a more junior person. You might look at a job share even. So you've got a bunch of salary that you can potentially allocate elsewhere to help take up the rest of the work that you've shaved off.
Yeah. And if you hire someone junior, then you can spend the rest of morning teas.
Totally. You can make them full-time. So what was 40% of a really senior person's salary might be a full-time salary for someone quite entry level. So yeah.
Yeah. And to go back to kind of the point that you made previously about looking almost like a task analysis of that role, like I think it's really cool from one being able to pass out some of those other responsibilities to develop someone else, but also kind of from almost like from a hygiene perspective around your practices, as well as like, actually, here's just some superfluous stuff that you're filling up a spreadsheet and sending it off to someone and no one really looks at it anymore. So why don't we just get rid of that? Because we've got a better way to do this. So I think from a work practice hygiene perspective is like, that's really probably really valuable to do, even if you don't have someone going into wanting to kind of reshape their role in any capacity.
Absolutely. People get it. And I've had whole teams do this in the context of someone in the team working part-time. How do we take a team-based approach to unpicking our work like that and thinking about how do we best deliver our work as a team? Inevitably, everyone gets a lot of value, whether they're part-time or full-time, of doing that picking and analysis. So
Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. Okay, so we've been shifting leaders and managers' mindsets around part-time work. For people like me 5 years ago, or no, maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago, how could I be thinking differently, or how could be the people that are sitting on the fence about flexible work, how can we move their mindsets and move, I guess, their curiosity around what their world might look like? Because we were talking
Mm,
earlier as well about like the last couple of years, and probably, well, at least for people, for myself and for people in my circle as well, is like it's raised a few questions about our values and about the way that we live our lives and kind of what we're hoping to achieve. And I don't know if it's like it's purely COVID related, or if it's young family related, or if it's I'll be 40 next year, kind of time of life related, or if it's probably all of those things rolled up into a ball, and just kind of rethinking, like, where do I want to go from here? Like, how do I want to live? What's important to me? And I think, like, we've talked that flexible work for me, like as my boys grow up, is really important, and having that flexibility to kind of be there around school hours, or at least be there some of the time around school hours, and have my wife be there some of the time around school hours as well. So yeah, how do we kind of get people a little bit more curious about exploring this topic for themselves, and a way that
mm.
might kind of lead to living a more meaningful life?
I think one thing is that we need to see more people role modeling it. And so, especially people in senior roles. So, if you've got someone who's interested in a big career, but feels like if I take up a flexible or part time work option, that's going to be at the expense of my big career. One of the ways that we can shift that mindset is around having more senior people in organizations actually working part time and showing that it's possible and something that the organization supports. And one of the things that I did in my book is interview a bunch of really senior leaders who work part time and do it successfully, partly to learn how they did it, but partly just to have those stories in there to show people what's possible. And I interviewed both men and women. And I think in the end, there's more stories from men in the book as well. So I think that's another element of the role modeling, back to our conversation around up till now, part-time work has largely been something that's taken up by women, not entirely, but more often than not. And so how do we have people role model it? It can help shift people's mindsets if they're seeing more people do it. But I also think just asking yourself those questions, like you were just talking about, where do I want to go with my life? What would I, in an ideal world, like to spend time in my week doing? If, let's say if money wasn't an object, or if worrying about what other people thought about me wasn't an object, or it wasn't a concern, how would I ideally spend my week? And in 10 years' time, when I look back, what would I love to have achieved? And is everything in that bucket work related, or are there lots of other things I'd like to spend my time on? And therefore, how might I structure my work and my life differently? So I think a bit of self-reflection can be helpful, as well as just seeing more people doing it and working in different ways.
Yeah. And that's a topic that I did want to explore with you as well, is that, I mean, the role model stories in your book are awesome. And I think, like, if we're thinking about, like, if we kind of put a performance lens on over it, as like, okay, I've got these things that I want to achieve. I want to, I don't know, become a CEO, or I want to kind of really progress in my career, as well as doing this other stuff here. Have those people in those positions switched their role to part-time since they arrived there, or did they get there in a part-time capacity as well?
That's a great question, because most of the time these days, the way people get part-time roles is by working in an organization full-time, building up a level of credibility, and then asking to go part-time. But a number of the leaders I interviewed had actually gone into quite senior level roles and applied for a role that was full-time, asked if they could do it part-time, and successfully negotiated that, which is still quite unusual. And one person in particular in my book, I recall his story, was that the organization that he was applying to work with were really not that keen on the idea. And so they said to him, why don't you trial working full time for 6 months with us? And then if that's all going smoothly, we'll reassess your request to work part time. And so he flipped it and he said, actually, why don't we do the reverse? Why don't I come in, I work part time for 6 months, and if it's going really well, we'll keep it like that. And if it's not, then we'll reassess. And so they agreed. And 6 months in, no one actually even mentioned it to him. It was going so well that no one brought up the conversation again. And he's been working part time with that organization ever since.
Sweet. That's really cool. And I guess like part of the, like, if you're coming into those negotiations with your employer, like what are some helpful things for you to be thinking about as you pitch this idea to them?
So definitely back to that role scoping that we've talked about. You want to have a think about, here's my ideas on what I can do. Let's say you want to work 3 days a week or 4 days a week, whatever it is. Here's what I understand the full-time role entails. Here's how I propose we restructure it to a part-time role, and even some ideas on what could be done with the rest of the work. If you're going into an organization you haven't worked for before, your understanding of level of detail around the role will be a bit less than if you know the role well, but just having some ideas on, I've got a toolkit, I really understand how to restructure a role, and here's how I propose we do it, would be one thing. Also having some stories up your sleeve of other people who work in similar roles or similar levels of roles part-time, and how you've seen it or heard it work well in other organizations. Of course, if you're, the person they want most for the role, you've also got that as your bargaining chip, this is the only option for me. So being quite clear on, if you want me to be in your organization, this is what I want, and working full-time is not going to be an option. But then just broadly talking to them about, this is where the future of work is heading. Organizations are looking at more and different forms of flexibility. I'm happy to help you, be an employer who can get part-time work right. If you're not doing it much, we can use me as a pilot, and just sharing what you know. So make sure you do know this around why part-time work is great for organizations. So getting good talent, it can be good for productivity. We talked about, freeing up some budget to spend on other things, lots of reasons why it can be good. And also diversity, of course, as we talk through all the reasons people might want to work part-time earlier, probably clear that this is also an issue of diversity. If you want to attract the best, but also the most diverse talent, thinking about part-time work is really important.
Yeah. And Belle, how do you scope your role, the work that you do?
Interesting. So I work for myself now. And so it's interesting because it's very different. The book that I wrote, and when I work with people, it's really focused on in an organization where you're an employee. So thinking about, how do I scope my work? It's a little bit different, but what I guess I think about first is, how many days a week do I want to work? And then what does my work involve? So the work that I do at the moment, it involves selling work, it involves designing work, and it involves delivering work. And so I have to make sure over a period of time that I can fit all those things in. But you can have big chunks of time where, I was just talking to you earlier about how I'm in a design phase at the moment. So I'm actually not doing that much selling and delivering for the next few weeks, because I'm just going to design. And so sometimes as I'm talking, what I'm thinking is, I've got to be really clear that you can't do everything all at once. Because when you've got your own business, that's the temptation, to think I've got to work all the time and do everything all at once and be all things to all people, or I'm not going to make any money, or I'm going to miss out on all these opportunities.
And there's always more stuff to do.
There's always more stuff to do. So I think for me, it's being really clear on what are the things I need to do in my business, and what's the most important thing to focus on this week. How can I maybe fit some other little things in? But just being really clear and constantly reminding myself you can't do everything. And also being really clear on, here's why I want these days off. At the moment, for me, it's about spending time with my 5-year-old who's not at school yet on my days off. And what's the cost of just letting creep work into those days? It's not what I want. And if I look back on this year and, notice that I've spent all my Fridays working while she's in front of the TV, it's not what I want and not where I want to go. So keeping that in mind.
Yeah, cool. And that was a really selfish question as well from me, is like, I kind of step into working for myself more and more as well. Well, If people want to pick up your book or want to get in contact with you, where's the best place for them to do that?
So my website's probably the best place. So belindamorgan.com. And you can buy my book on there. You can also buy it on all the online retailers. You can also sign up to my newsletter down the bottom of my website if you're interested with fortnightly tips around working flexibly. Also, I'm on LinkedIn, so do feel free to reach out and connect on LinkedIn.
And it'll be really helpful for ideas and for stories as well to pitch to your employer if you're negotiating a part-time or flexible work option as well. Belle, I've got some questions that I like to ask everyone, and these are a kind of a sharp left turn from our topics today. But the first one is, do you have any strategies that you use when you're approaching uncomfortable situations? So perhaps if you are going to negotiate a part-time role or thinking about negotiating your first part-time role.
Mm. So strategies for me, I do a few things. Sometimes I listen to a song that's really energizing. So I like Uptown Funk by Bruno Mars is one of my go-to songs. If you're feeling uncomfortable, then kind of getting yourself in a more positive mood with some music can be helpful. Also thinking about, I guess this is similar tips to I'd provide with if someone said I'm not feeling confident in a situation. So maybe there's overlap here. I think of all the times that I've been successful in the past, maybe in similar situations or maybe in different situations would be the second one. So just think back, I can do this. I've done something similar or I've faced challenges that are equally as hard and managed to overcome them would be probably my second tip. And then and I'm sure this is something, and I know this is something you talk about a lot, Chris, just being okay with the idea that I'm going to go in and give it my best. And if it doesn't work, that's fine. I've tried.
Yeah, nice. And are there things that you do proactively to build your capacity to tackle challenging situations?
Probably I try to do a little bit of yoga every day. So thinking about how do you look after your own well-being. And for me at the moment, something that I can easily fit in is a little bit of yoga at home and a walk when I can. So I think that's for me one of the things that's really important. Yeah, that's probably the main one that comes to mind actually.
And yoga's an interesting one. Like it's physically reasonably uncomfortable as you get into some of those poses. And I always find with yoga, like you can't force your way into some of those positions. Like you've got to kind of slowly find your way and just move into them and stop when you've had enough and let your body adapt to it as well. And I think it's like yoga is probably quite a nice metaphor for building your capacity for challenges, like moving into a bit of discomfort, taking a break when you need to before going further and kind of figuring out the right way at the time.
Yeah, I love it. And being okay that you're never going to be able to do something. My hamstrings are just never going to be the most flexible hamstrings ever. So there's some things in yoga I just can't do. And that's
you can improve them though, Ben. You will be able to improve them. We're talking in 5 years' time and you'll be doing the splits in all sorts of different directions.
Maybe.
One other question, and you've kind of partially answered it already, is like, what do you do to look after your health?
So definitely what I just mentioned around thinking about a little bit of exercise every day outdoors for me is probably the other thing. So I live in Sydney, but I'm lucky to live in an area where there's beaches and lots of bushland too. So for me, if I'm ever feeling like I'm not on top of the world, just getting outside into nature is a big one.
Yeah, nice. Belle, thank you so much for getting uncomfortable with me today. It's been an awesome conversation. I definitely recommend if you're thinking about kind of living a meaningful life and the role that work plays in that, is picking up Belle's book. There's so many lessons in it, not just for people in organizations, but for people who are doing their own thing as well. So thanks again, Belle, for spending some time with me.
Thanks, Chris. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you so much for getting uncomfortable with us today. I always love these conversations. If you want to hear a guest, if you want to have a topic explored, if you want to ask a question, please send an email to chris@healthmentors.nz and we can get onto that for you. If you want to support the show, the best way that you can do that is subscribe on your favorite podcast app and make sure to share it out with some of your mates as well. Thank you to Health Mentors, the sponsor of the show today. If you want to improve your health and your performance in the middle of a chaotic world, make sure to check out healthmentors.nz or send an email to chris@healthmentors.nz for a no obligation chat. Thank you so much to my brother Jeremy Desmond for the amazing theme music to the show. And thank you to you guys for tuning in and listening all the way to the end. We'll see you all again next week.